Hey, what's going on, everybody? Thanks, guys, for putting on a killer event. Like I said, having something like this, I think when we were getting out of transition or first starting, would have been transformative. We sort of all figured it out in the dark. Second, I always joke with my VC buddies, welcome to dual use after a successful year of JPEG monkeys and crypto schemes. It's lovely to have you. Hopefully you stick around for a while. And I'm excited to talk about sort of the reality of dual use, right? Like dual use has become fetch. Everybody's tweeting about national security. Everybody's talking about it, but it's hard, right? There's a lot of stuff that folks don't get into and don't talk about sort of the reality of what it is to scale. So we got some great folks on the panel. I'm gonna let them introduce themselves and we'll get after it. Sonny.
Great, my name is Sonny Tai. I'm CEO and co-founder of a company called Actuate. Happy to be back in the most overrated city in the world. As soon as I got off on Powell Street off the BART, right, came from SFO, and there was already somebody yelling expletives at me. So good times, good times. But yeah, we build computer vision software for security cameras, enabling existing cameras, hardware agnostic to identify threats to safety and security. So looking forward to sharing more about our experiences.
There we go. Probably better. Okay. Hey, I'm Grant Jordan. I'm the CEO of Skysafe. We're a San Diego-based counter-drone systems company. My background, I was an Air Force officer working in AFRL for a number of years, working on counter-IED sensor systems, was involved in some of the DoD's early counter-drone testing events. My team's been building counter-drone systems and, dual use. A lot of the problems of drones cut across both military environments and everyday areas. So, happy to be here.
Hey, everyone. I'm Matt Cox. I'm the founder and CEO for a company called Beacon AI. We make flight safety and efficiency technology. Before this, I did a few things. One of them was I was at Cruise, where I led the ladder software team. So if you've seen one of them get stuck in town, I don't work there anymore. Before that, I was in the Navy. I flew F-18s. A lot of familiar faces here at this conference, so thanks everyone for being here, and I look forward to questions.
Awesome. So I want to open it up, kind of a softball. As we talk about sort of dual use and cutting across, and we talk often, as founders and as C-suite folks and leaders about having sort of clarity on product market fit and really understanding your user. That dual use creates some sort of complexity in there. Right, as we're thinking about what is go-to-market, what does an ICP look like, how am I thinking about unit economics, all of that stuff that gets taken for granted with sort of the glossy, hey, it's cool to be doing dual-use stuff. I'd like to hear from each of you how you guys are sort of weighing the cost and the benefit on things like forking product and thinking about a different delivery model, right? Thinking about, like I said, a different ICP, a different buying pattern, all of that. We'll start in the middle. So we'll go Grant.
Sure. Yeah, well, I think for me, one of the critical things in thinking about dual use and thinking about building systems and products that are applicable across both military environments and civilian is, I think for us, because we started out on the military side, our first contract was with DoD, with Naval Special Warfare through, at that time, DIUX, and I think it is potentially easy to focus the design of that product potentially too tightly around that military market and, think about things in the way that military people think about them using military terminology. For us, right, we put drones on a map, right? And if we're thinking about how military people think about drones, should we be representing things as the NATO standard symbols for these things? Or should we be, making them look like a little quadcopter because that's how normal human beings actually think about these things? So, keeping your eventual different markets and customers in mind, I think is crucial. Not letting yourself slip into narrowing your vision and your product exactly to those initial, defense customers or defense applications, and really thinking about what are the common things across both sets. What do they really care about? What are the problems they're trying to solve? Because, for example, in our world, when thinking about counter-drone, when thinking about airspace management, it's really the same problem, whether you're talking about a FOB and drones that might be coming over the wall there, or a prison in the US where there might be drones coming over in the middle of the night to drop a package. It's very different environments, very different customers, but fundamentally they're all trying to solve the same problem. Same thing with airports with civilians. Everyone's worried about the same thing. I think that's that's one of the things that's exciting to me about dual use issues and technologies is that you're solving common problems across the board for these different areas.
We'll do a quick exercise. Who here is a veteran? Put your hand up, please. All right. Who is now a civilian and obviously out? Or now you're a veteran, you're out. Cool. While you were in the military, did you find any problems during your service at all? Any inefficiencies? Something that didn't work, maybe once? Okay, awesome. You might be a good candidate to be a dual-use company. And the reason I kind of joke about that is most of the problems that you find in the military probably exist in the civilian world. And I think most of the audience here is in the potential entrepreneur side from the earlier panels. So I'll kind of focus most of my answers, I think, in that direction. So for that purpose, you may have unique insights into an aspect of the dual-use market that your non-veteran potential competitors won't have. So you may have a whole second market that you get to expose for that same problem because of your background. The tricky part, though, as the question raised, is that they often have very different sales cycles. They may have different certifications. They may have different willingness to pay. And I think that can be a really big distraction when you're a small company and you're trying to figure out how do you make a foothold and really like deliver value. Trying to serve both simultaneously is quite hard.
Yeah, so when I forgot to mention that I was in the Marine Corps before, and when I was at the basic school, I remember as a lieutenant, we were taught that if you're strong everywhere, you're strong nowhere, right? You have to orient your defense towards enemy's most likely avenue of approach. So I do think that for dual-use companies, you have to decide if you're first and foremost a commercial company or first and foremost a defense company. Like, if you try to be both, at least initially, in a resource-constrained environment, you're going to die. We started as a commercial company. We are still primarily a commercial company. And in full transparency, we're having a damn hard time finding traction with the DoD right now. We're trying, and we think there's a lot of great use cases. But at the very least, we have our commercial business to fall back on and that traction, the investment. So the way that we stumbled into it was that, so as I mentioned, we built AI software for security cameras, enabling them to identify things like intruders, loiterers, gun threats, so on and so forth. So we started by selling to schools and school districts on kind of like gun detection monitoring. Then eventually, after a pandemic, we pivoted towards more perimeter protection, so protecting areas like construction sites, car dealerships, utilities plants, so on and so forth. But the way that we stumbled into the whole DoD scene was that the Army Application Lab actually went out there and started scouting startups. And they dropped into our inbox, asking us to apply to their program to inventory or use computer vision to support like field artillery, like autonomous resupply of field artillery. So I told my co-founder, I was like, dude, this is a distraction. Let's not touch it. He said, what are you talking about? We have no traction right now. Let's apply for this. It's like $250,000 if we get it, right? I just have to write a white paper. Turns out he was right and I was wrong. And we ended up getting a SBIR phase 2 out of it that was $1.6 million of funding over 2 years. And that actually just expired, and we are trying to get that funding extended. But even throughout our time of raising funding, and we raised our Series A in May of 2021, like, our investors never gave us credit for those defense revenues. They didn't see it as scalable and repeatable. They saw it as one-off. They said, hey, you got contribution margin, that's great, but the valuation that we raised at was based off of our commercial revenues, not our defense revenues. So it's an endless uphill battle to get traction in defense, and generally I feel like startups either have expertise in one or the other. You have a team that is really familiar with that go-to-market motion and building a commercial business, or you have a team that is really damn good at navigating the intricacies of applying for SBIRs, getting that kind of grant funding, finding a sponsor that's going to sponsor you for a phase 2, and driving towards a phase 3. I think that part is really, really, really hard. And I think that that's a challenge that a lot of companies that like to call ourselves and want to be true dual use continuously struggle with, including us. So I don't know if I fully answered your question, but that's been our experience so far.
Between the three of you, there's a couple things that sort of popped out. One is the ability as that sort of evangelist to translate, right? And like everybody sort of got to it in their own way, but like a problem in industry A, a regulated industry, is gonna also exist in government. They'll call it something different because there's a buzzword for it, so you've got to have a little bit of a decoder ring. But the same problem's there. Where you just got to this on it with talking about both sort of SBIR, which I'm going to follow up this question with, but when we're talking about contribution margin and we're thinking about the actual financials, you know, my question, and I get asked this all the time from folks who are coming in, they're getting ready to launch, they're going out for their first round of funding, and they're trying to think about how they communicate with investors about TAM and about SAM and about the actual market, right? And you'll see folks who are like, oh, the DoD spends $400 billion. Our TAM's $400 billion. And you're like, sick. All right. Like, there's an A in there. What's the addressable part? And that's where I'd love to hear from you as you're looking out. There's a bunch of folks that are at this event that are sort of coming in. They're coming up. They're getting ready to start their first company, their first sort of endeavor. What do you know now, sort of coming through this, having government revenue not get counted towards ARR, towards evaluation multiple? Having conversations around forking and around thinking, is this a distraction? What's the sales cycle? What's the COGS look like? When you look now, how would you tell somebody to think about the TAM and sort of just the market writ large of coming in government? We'll go Sonny first. We'll just go in order. This is way easier.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about the TAM, I mean, we definitely don't think about like, the $858 billion defense budget that was just passed. I mean, of course, like we all know that a bunch of that already goes with servicing existing gear and benefits for salaries and benefits for personnel, so on and so forth. I'll be honest with you, I would struggle with this because in our seed deck, forget the seed deck because that defense didn't even go in there, but our Series A deck, we sized the TAM based on our commercial business, and the DoD didn't really go into it. So I think that we would have a hard time really getting a grasp of how we would size that market. But if I were to do it today, I would say that whichever problem that you are solving, if the United States military decide to adopt your solution and roll it out across the entire force, I think that will be your TAM, right? Of course, you would start initially with a small unit and then eventually roll it out, but I think that's probably the right way to think about it. It's probably not going to end up being as big as you would expect. The second thing is, like, when you're talking about TAM, it means that you're pitching to venture capitalists. And I do think that as a defense-first company, you're at a distinct disadvantage and not at an advantage. And the reason for that is because, like, you're selling to one customer, right? And this one customer has a lot of different departments, but everybody knows that selling to government has very, very, very long sales cycles. A year if you're lucky, likely 2, 3, right? Like, we've closed a deal in 2 weeks before on a commercial side, right? That will never happen with the DoD. And investors see that and they have to factor that into your risk. And it's also very, very difficult to get initial traction. Like, just because you land a SBIR doesn't mean that an investor is going to see that and be like, hey, you have traction, because what they're looking for is annual recurring revenues, right? And even if it's not recurring revenues, it's something that, like, the DoD is paying for a product or a service, not just paying for R&D. There's a term that investors use, they call it NRE, non-recurring engineering. And they see SBIRs as non-recurring engineering. They won't give you credit for it when you go out there and raise. So it's a challenge, and I'll be honest with you, like, maybe I'm not really seeing the whole picture, but when I see defense companies that become really, really, really successful, like the Palantirs and Andurils, I don't know how to say that word correctly, but Anduril of the world.
Everybody says it differently.
Yeah, all right. It seems like they already started with a very distinct, like, critical mass and some sort of advantage, and they didn't truly start like 2 founders scrapping it out from seed stage and beyond, right? Like, to be honest with you, I haven't really seen a pure play defense company go from seed all the way to billion-dollar valuation, focusing primarily only on defense, but I might be wrong. So,
wow, there's so many good topics within this. I think a couple points that came to mind as you were speaking there. I think number one, on the fundraising side, to me, I think that you're right in that most VCs won't really essentially give you credit for those sorts of government contracts, government work. I think the key in the VC side is to find VCs who do actually understand and relate to and want to invest in the defense market. Because to me, it's very binary. They either understand it and want to be involved in that, or they do not. So I would just say don't waste time with VCs who don't already have some exposure to or background in or investments in the defense world. I think for us, I saw that very clearly, literally from back in our seed round fundraise back in 2015, 2016, there were investors that got it and there were investors that did not. And you could tell in the first couple questions in that interaction whether they got it or they didn't. And, but it's a little bit funny to think back on. I think it was in my Series A deck when I was trying to, because we had a DoD contract at that time, and I was trying to, kind of talk to investors, and this was back in early 2017. I was trying to give them the sense of like, okay, what do follow-on contracts in DoD things mean? Because we all know like large-scale defense contracts, they end up being kind of winner-take-all or winner-take-most kind of things. They end up as, at the far end, these very large contracts. And I actually literally had in my pitch deck, I had the example of the contract for the Humvee replacement for the JLTV that Oshkosh Defense won over AM General. And that initial contract was like a $30 billion contract. And it's the kind of contract that, made Oshkosh a massive winner and crushed AM General in like a single contract win. But just trying to give them a sense of like, this is what large-scale defense contracts actually look like. And I think that at least gave an idea of where it could be. It may be high risk, high reward kind of thing on the defense side. The other thing I would kind of mention in a somewhat related idea is, you talked about kind of initial traction on military side stuff and how difficult that can be. I think, so I've kind of seen both sides, as on the one side as an Air Force acquisitions officer, and on the other side as a startup CEO trying to get contracts and figure that stuff out. And I think I have very strong opinions on like acquisition reform and all of these things, which I won't bore you with. But yes, but one of the things that I think is tough for a lot of startups in the defense space and the dual use space is that kind of chasm of death of, there's a lot of organizations that have been stood up in the last, 5 to 10 years thinking about, okay, how does the Department of Defense connect with and, help and get the technology from small innovative startups. You have your DIUs and your SoftWorks, AFWorks, AF Ventures, all these things. That's important, getting the very front end of the funnel, but then there's a big disconnect between that front end of the, let's call it $1 to $5 million contracts on the input side, and what is kind of the traditional acquisitions world on the, let's say $50 million and up kind of side, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars. I think a lot of people in the DoD space, are very excited about the small picture thing of the interacting with small startups. It's the very sexy, cool thing to do in the DoD acquisitions world, from my perspective. But I don't think people have really put the effort yet into that middle stage of how do we actually follow on from that. And I think that's one of the difficult things of getting credit for those early contracts with early customers in DoD, getting those prototypes out, getting those first use cases, is because there is no guarantee that if your thing works and does well, that there will be follow-on, right? And especially with a lot of these efforts, like DIU and whatnot, one of the things that the DoD acquisition side suffers from is churn, right? If you've got a relationship that your company has built up with those with the active duty folks on that side, that's great. You built up that relationship over a series of months. You got an initial contract, and then you've delivered on that. And then right around the time it comes time to figure out, hey, wow, this was really a great thing. What do we transition it for? The officer who's there is now PCSing somewhere else. And they're like, great, meet the brand new major over here who's gonna, talk to you about your new thing. Like, how do you solve that? It's really difficult. And I recognize the fact that from the DoD side, it is really difficult. There's no magical solution to that. But I think that's one of the challenges. And I think if the DoD solves that middle state, that transitional state, of transitioning more of these things into greater use in figuring out contract vehicles in that gap, I think that feeds back into the VC world better recognizing those early wins and seeing that there's a direct path and seeing the value in that and being able to give startups credit for that and like see that vision to connect from that first $1.5 million contract on an OTA to the $30 billion Oshkosh contract later on. Somebody's got to connect that. So I think that's one of the missing links in the current system and the things that are difficult for startups.
Cool. There's a few items there. One, I wasn't planning on mentioning it too. You just mentioned it, but I've learned that the innovation officer is code word for I get out in less than 6 months. I didn't know that actually, because I hadn't met any until I was already out. So I was unaware that was the I'm getting out in less than 6 months. I'm looking for a job, but I'll listen to whatever you guys do. So for our company, the question was about TAM. On our deck, I don't think we listed a single thing about government market sizes or anything. And it's funny because most of our signed revenue, which isn't ARR, of course, but most of our signed revenue is actually government. And barring any setback, this month we'll sign another contract that'll take our total signed revenue above our total cash burn since the beginning of the company, which for a deep tech company is hard to do. And we're obviously grateful for our DoD partners to have helped that happen. Otherwise, you don't get to do that. That said, the vast majority of our current sales motion is in the commercial market, just because of the amount of gray hair accumulation that the DoD market presents. And then, I was at DIU. I started Scale AI's government business. I was a core, and now we sell to it. I feel like I have every advantage. We built a product that actually was the job I did in the military too. So like I have every advantage, and even then, selling to the DoD is awful. We don't. The question was about TAM. For our market and our TAM, we really just think of like what the commercial market looks like. It's easier to predict. There's more of them too. I mean, like for us in aviation, there's just so many more potential customers on the commercial side that we can scale it so much better. It's a bigger market, but willingness to pay is so different. The DoD is willing to pay for things that they think are in their future roadmap. No, I don't know what obviously everyone else is doing here, but no commercial company is going to pay you in these kind of research R&D things at the same level that the DoD does. Obviously, what we do we think is in the roadmap, so I think it makes sense. But just the willingness to pay is totally different between the two segments, even if it's the exact same product.
Yeah, I think I'll go sort of pull on that thread on like the NRE a little bit. I think one of the things I've seen for sure in both, the companies I've been at and a bunch that I'm advising is folks getting distracted by the NRE and being like, oh, some captain in Squadron X who's like the guy who got assigned to my SIBR wants the widget to look like this, like turn product left. And you realize that they've just built and built and built this like hyper specific thing that serves like one small team. And then every 3 years, the base is refreshing its entirety of personnel. So there's an aspect on focus, right? You've got to have that sort of discipline. When we're talking about, you use the chasm of death. My buddy Enrique, who's a big fan of the Valley of Death. I think there's like 7 centers at Stanford working on it right now. But like real talk, there's 2 main things that are usually sitting in between that first sort of SBIR, that kind of innovation grant, and starting to think about like a production contract at scale, right? One is identifying the procurement pathway and sort of having the patience for it. So can you get a vehicle that's going to allow for an order like the Oshkosh one? That's not going to force you to say, okay, here's my labor rate and here's how I'm thinking about scale, and I'm gonna try to wrap this and call this a subscription revenue, but it's just butts and seats and I look just like every other contractor. You've got to avoid that. The second one is thinking through sort of all of the security and compliance, right? Things like facility clearances, like ATOs, like any facility clearances and stuff like that. What I would be curious is, as we look startup sort of innovation offices, your DIUs, your X Works, there's 800 of them now, and you look at programs of record, and you look at line items in NDAA, right? There's a bunch of fluff at the front door, and then there's a highly entrenched set of defense primes and integrators that sit right there. We've got some in the room. Happy they're here. I have been skeptical of sort of their engagement with emerging tech. I have been really skeptical when programs of record tell me to go through a prime and don't understand that I'm gonna have to negotiate IP rights and most favored nation clauses, and I'm gonna be constricted on my price, and all of my mobility in the market is gonna be limited onto the potential promise of revenue, right? So what I'd be curious is you guys are thinking about how to actually cross that. What does that look like? What advice do you give? What mistakes have you made? What have you learned? What would you do differently? Getting from sort of A to B, and I'm gonna go in reverse. I keep making you go last. You're up first, brother.
Yeah, sure. So a few things to unpack there. So first off, as far as primes go, yeah, I think you're right. From the DoD side, way easier to have a single point that they're comfortable with. They already know how to contract. They'd rather even pay extra to just not have to deal with the complexities of another prime or some other relationship, which is fine, except for the amount of times that the DoD has asked us to expose core IP to a direct competitor or something like that, which shows a lack of understanding of how the business world works. I guess it's shocking, but I'm seeing lots of head nods, so I guess not that shocking. So that, I guess that's kind of the first part. And then I think it is important to partner with people like primes and things like that. There are stuff that they'll be able to do that you won't. We talked about the Oshkosh Award. If someone gave me a $30 billion contract to make all of the replacement Humvees or LRTVs or whatever it was, I don't think we'd be well equipped to solve that problem. So we would need to work with somebody to do that. My general rule when it comes to primes is you should try to avoid partnering with ones that think that they can do what you do. And you should try to partner with ones that you think you can't do what they do. And that leads to the most healthy relationship. Outside of that, it can get, I think, pretty contentious. And I've seen some pretty unfortunate ones play out very poorly. There's lots and lots of chops. I guess I can dive into that more with examples if anyone wants it, but otherwise I'll move on.
Oh man, so that's an interesting topic. Okay, so there's two things that you had me thinking about there with the way that DoD thinks about different companies in the ecosystem, how they should be involved, who's a prime, whatnot. A few years back, there was a thing, SoftWorks, for SOCOM, had put out a call for a particular challenge they were looking at or whatever, right? And so they had all of these companies, many of which were small businesses, many of which were startups, come down to Tampa. Everybody was sitting in the same room, and they put up all the slides about their challenge. And then at the end, they said, okay, so what do people think? Talk about solutions, talk about ideas. And everyone in that room is just kind of dude, we're competitors. What are you talking about? This wasn't a contract where everybody was already on contract with, subcontractors and stuff, and now let's all be on the same team and solve the same problem. They had just gotten a room full of competitors and asked them to brainstorm together and solve this problem together. And it's it was just crickets in the room. Nobody was talking about anything. So there was definitely a bad approach there. There was a misunderstanding compared to how you would traditionally deal with that with government contractors who were already under contract, who were already selling them the direct work and the direct NRE, right? And not understanding kind of how that should actually work in kind of the innovation economy, right? And that the fact that the currency of startups is owning their IP and not just doing contracting work and not just grinding on a problem for someone for money. But let me say the opposite side of that story, which is for that same problem set, the folks over at SOCOM, they did a really good thing on the back end, thinking, from the SoftWorks side, thinking creatively and thinking okay, how can we make the best outcome for everyone? At that time, for that particular problem, they literally, they called me the next week and they said, hey, Grant, what you guys showed us, you guys had the best technology, but there's this other company that we already buy this tool from that we already use for these other uses. You should go talk to them and you two should partner. Then you do your core technology piece, you still own that. They're manufacturing that piece of hardware. We, SOCOM, are only having to buy one tool. Everybody wins. This is great. And it turned out that actually was a great solution. Like, I'm generally a very like anti-partnering, you know, sharing stuff kind of thing. But they, from their vantage point on the DoD side, they were able to see that opportunity that I would have never seen, that this other company would have never seen, that like we would have never gotten together. So that ability for the DoD to be that matchmaker when it actually makes sense and when they can see that opportunity and when it just can benefit everyone and nobody loses anything, everyone benefits, that's a tremendous opportunity. And you know, I don't know how the traditional acquisition system would ever create an opportunity like that. And it worked great for us, it worked great for the company, it worked great for SOCOM. So there can be these things that can work, there can be these things that can be unique, but it requires a little bit of new thinking about it and a little bit of like everyone's willingness to come to the table and think about, you know, what the priorities are for everybody, what the boundaries are.
Yeah, I probably have very little to add compared to you two, just because it seems like we're a little bit earlier than you two. But when there's a prime, which we've been working with one on kind of our previous contract, happy to latch onto their coattails because we know that we're not big enough or entrenched enough to be the prime ourselves. Just like you said, we don't want to deal with it. So if that's a vehicle, and we have a good relationship with that prime, so if that's a vehicle for us to get to the next phase of the contract and actually perhaps even bring in real scalable ARR, then we're totally happy to do so. The other thing as well is that I do think that personally, at least as an AI company, ideas are a dime a dozen, right? Like I'll talk to competitors about what I'm thinking for the most part. I don't really care. Our IP is in the training data that we've harvested over the past 5 years, and all of that work accumulated layer upon layer that we've sank into refining our AI models, and that's not something that a competitor can just kind of steal over a conference or something like that, for example. So at least for our business model, we're a lot less concerned about that and much more open to having open conversations about how we can collaborate. But you know, every company's different. So.
All right, so as we're continuing to go through, I'm going to kind of take us in a little bit different direction, but I recognize at the last panel there was like audience Q&A, so I can't tell if anyone's actually paying attention. So if you have a question, just raise your hand up. I think the microphone wizard will bring you one. Yes, got microphone people. So if you got questions, you want to ask the gang, just put a hand up. We'll stop, we'll grab it. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep driving. Any takers initially? Oh, we got one. God damn.
Thanks. Hey, thanks for the panel. My name's Andrew Berry. I'm an AI startup advisor and have worked at DIU as a part-time reservist in the reserves. My question for you, though, was about the interest you might be seeing from investment firms. When you describe that you're doing dual use and you've got these potentially big dollars from the government at a time when commercial is struggling, do you see that they are receptive to that, or do they have some doubt about what you're trying to do?
We just did RA. So I think it depends. I don't know how to say this without sounding a little disrespectful. I think there's a lot of like performative interest in national security in the venture community right now, and it's doing a disservice to a lot of founders. You go on Twitter right now, and everybody's into defense tech, and it's rad. But if you look at who's actually slinging checks, it's not a lot of them. They're all just posturing because it's the cool thing right now, like it's the new crypto. What I have found is if you can explain like a path to clean unit economics and the same fundamentals, but you've got to be able to talk about how you're going to get there and actually have thought through some of the barriers, whether that's, hey, how am I going to get my authority to operate? How am I going to get this production contract, or what's my partnership play, and sort of a little bit of a user? Yeah, there's absolutely checks to write. You're going to fight an uphill battle on like a dollar for dollar basis, right? They're going to dismiss it. You're going to have revenue that you want to count that they're not going to let you count. You're going to have a little bit of a weird sales cycle you're going to have to account for. If you're truly dual use and you can offset that way, I think there's a lot of ways you can overcome that, and that's what we did. Right? Like all the revenue we used for RA was commercial. We didn't use any of our government revenue, even though our TAM is like right on the fence of government and commercial. Little long-winded. It's just going to be a slog, and it's a weird year right now. Everyone keeps changing the math.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I didn't hear the question fully, but just based on the context of your answer, I can kind of I can't understand what the question is. But I echo that it's going to be a slog if you're defense focused. And I do feel like there's that. It's not just a chasm of death. I feel like it's quicksand, right? Because government procurement cycles are so long and brutal, and you have to stay alive somehow. So in absence of a big seed check that allows you to have a shit ton of runway, I think a lot of companies just go and apply for SIBR after SIBR after SIBR to try to freaking stay alive and get cash in the door. And that also takes a lot of freaking energy to do so. You got to fill out a shit ton of paperwork. You got to keep following up. You got to build these prototypes that may not be core to your business just for your company to remain processing oxygen, right? And that starts detracting you from your core mission of what you intended to build and delivering the product that you intend to deliver to your ICP. So I know I kind of answered a question with a question, but I think that's a real struggle. And it seems like a lot of us here started with a commercial focus, because by doing so, you can explain the TAM a lot easier. You can get traction a lot easier. You can get AR in a door. And once you get to Series A or maybe even Series B, and hey, if you're sitting on $30 million in a bank, it's a lot easier to say, hey, look, I want to expand into doing something dual use. I can survive a 2-year sales cycle if I have to. But starting at the seed stage or pre-seed stage, trying to be a government-focused company, man, that's freaking hard. I don't know even how even start that.
I would mainly just echo the statement I made earlier of when thinking about kind of VC world and fundraising and defense-related stuff, don't waste your time with people who don't understand and who don't get it and who don't have a direct interest, because I think you're not going to convince them by whipping out the giant defense acquisition process chart and walking them through it and showing how great that looks. It's just not going to happen. So you need to find the people that already understand, that already have an interest, that are looking for those opportunities, and they're going to be the ones that are going to be your best supporters along that path, right? Because it's not just about getting the check. It's about actually having investors and a board that supports you and that cares about what you're doing and that thinks that what you're doing is important. I think for us that's always been huge. From the beginning, all of our investors believe in what we do, period. None of them were convinced because of the amazing numbers I threw at them. It was all because they actually thought what we were doing was important and critical and necessary into the future. And because of that, we have just an amazing set of investors who've just been behind us the whole way. They're not hitting us up all the time to grind on numbers. They know where we're going. And I think if you don't do that, you can end up in very bad situations with investors who don't get it, who don't understand what the sales cycle looks like, who don't understand what the opportunities should or shouldn't be, and who maybe push you in bad directions that aren't good for you.
Yeah, I agree with everything I said, and then I guess I'll make a couple last points, which is do a defense or dual use company because you think that's a problem worth solving and there's a big enough TAM to cover the R&D costs and some profit and risk. You need to bake all of that in. And then on the venture side or the VC side, I think it is probably trendy at the moment. I would never hop into this market because it's trendy though. Because a year from now or 6 months from now, we'll have moved on to the next thing. Because 6 months ago it was NFTs, and you could buy a giraffe for $1 million or something. A picture of a giraffe, sorry. So I just I'd be careful. If you think this is a problem we're solving, and you're willing to dive fully into it, and you're going to commit yourself to it, and there's a big enough market to cover the costs for R&D and profit and risk and all of that, go do it, and you'll find the right investors.
And I think we're going to go, we've got a question question over here. And then Craig, I'll come to you after.
I just had one quick point, Tyler, not even a question. Our Moonshots Capital military fellow, Lieutenant Colonel Chris Mitchum, has that.
Yes, the chart. It's my favorite.
On him.
But do you have the
if anyone wants to see it.
Is that a cry for
awesome?
The Afghanistan decision-making one. The Afghanistan decision-making one. Has anyone seen this? It's okay.
Chris can explain it. Takes about 3 hours, but he'll do it for you.
No, I love that. And I just want to add, as we're thinking, I think, I'm very big advocate for sort of building defense tech. I think there's an expectation management. There's a misalignment, right? Like on traditional venture, I'm looking for, a certain X return on capital to an investor, right? I've got this success, right? It's a unicorn, right? Everybody loves them. I don't know if we should be trying to build unicorns in dual use and defense. I would argue that if we're actually talking about like true capability transition and success, I should be looking for $300 to $500 million exits to primes where it integrates into programs. But we misalign that from start, and then we wonder why this shit keeps breaking. And everyone's looking at each other, and everyone's disenfranchised. So it's a little bit of both sides of the table need to sort of look in the mirror and think about what reality looks like. Question.
How's it going? Carl Dietrich, Jump Arrow. So we've got a couple of phase twos, but we're generally new to government contracting. We've heard about phase 2Bs, we've heard about TAC-FIs and strat-FIs and these things that in theory are supposed to help bridge the gap to a phase 3. I'm curious if you guys have any personal experience with those, any war stories that you can share, recommendations, good, bad, what are the dangers, what are the pitfalls? Thank you.
So I've done 2 phase 2s and a TAC-FI. They can be super useful if you are focused and you're tight with not just the sponsor, but you're actually thinking about who buys and who uses in the future. You can use that as a foundation to go sort of evangelize and identify new customers and new sources of capital. You just have to be very careful that you're not using that capital to like dig a hole deeper. Like whatever your first prototype was, you've just got to be very careful that you don't get super narrow and you're building like one specific feature into infinity and it's only valuable to like one unit, so.
I mean, I'm in that shoe right now, right? Like with the phase 2 that we're trying to get to, a phase 2B to a phase 3, whatever the case may be. But I will say that we've declined to apply for certain opportunities that we did not feel supported our core competencies. Like we are not going to go and fork half our data science team to go build something that's completely net new, that's only going to serve some niche use case, because then the additional money in the door is not worth the distraction to the company. And I think that, at least for us, that's the right decision.
Oh man, I have such strong opinions in this space, and I'm gonna be like a tiny bit controversial and say I am almost entirely anti-cyber contract. And again, speaking from my former acquisition officer hat, I think for a VC-backed startup, I think they can often be a major distraction, and they can, as was kind of alluded to here, they can take you down a road of building very narrow solutions for very narrow customers that don't have that dual use. And I also think that it's very difficult to go to raise a funding round and try to explain that, well, we do own this IP for commercial uses, but I guess technically we don't actually own this IP for this defense space that we're trying to claim we're going to get a big contract for later, and that maybe they're just going to flip it to Raytheon instead. That's kind of hard. And I think, and that was some of the problems that groups like DIU were trying to solve with utilizing OTAs as a contract vehicle to not try to own the IP, to not try to make that kind of land grab. But SBIRs, if it's the right alignment, and there's been some work in the last few years on aligning SBIRs and straight to phase 2s, especially with more friendly terms in some sense, and aligning them with the interests of a startup and trying to do things there. But I have traditionally been relatively against them for the VC-backed startup kind of world. In my mind, the structure as it was created of SBIR contracts, I think they looked really good as an acquisition reform mechanism in the 80s going into the 90s. They were a big step in the right direction as far as getting, breaking kind of the stranglehold of the large defense primes, enabling small businesses. But I don't think they were created and structured with this kind of goal in mind of leveraging private capital on the VC side, because that just wasn't really a model at the time. So I have mixed feelings about that. And I think also one of the problems that I think arose out of the SBIR structure was the creation and the kind of prioritizing of SBIR mills, essentially. You know, it's easy to make a small business that stays a small business that cranks out phase 1 and phase 2 prototypes forever. And in some ways, that is the best business structure to take advantage of SBIRs. Unfortunately, you know, it shouldn't be. Like, that's not the goal of that contract vehicle. But I think it turned into that because, you know, people figured out how to, in a lot of ways, game the system and do that. And, you know, your interests as an entrepreneur raising, you know, venture-backed and doing dual-use stuff and trying to really build a fast-growing startup and doing modern technology, your interests are very different than a SBIR mill. And in my mind, you kind of shouldn't be playing the same game that they are, but it's easy to fall into. And, you know, and to be fair, again, different people have very different opinions about this than I do. You know, I don't represent anyone else other than me in this, but I'm not your lawyer or your acquisitions officer, but you know, just things to keep in mind.
Can I just say, like, I kid you not, one time we came across a SBIR that was almost like it was scoped exactly for what we do commercially. It's like, dude, we're TRL09. We already sell this commercially. We have customers. Definitely gonna get it. No, we didn't fucking get it. They probably awarded some SBIR mill. So that's what's frustrating about the program sometimes.
To hop on this, I think it all comes down to opportunities and distractions. And whether that's a SBIR or any contract or any feature request, I'd say almost every day, if not at least every week, we get a feature request from a commercial aviation company that the first thing I think of is this a distraction? And I weigh every single feature request, all of it, every single one of them. Like, is it going to be this plane? Is it going to be that customer? Is it going to be this feature? Every one of them, I weigh it against, do I think this is a distraction or an opportunity? And it's worth rechecking in on that, even like a month later, 3 months later, 6 months later. Even if, you know, if you've agreed to it, you start to think like, do I want to do more of this or less of this? And I think that's true whether that's a SBIR or really anything. You know, since it's a dual-use panel, I'd say that's at least as true in the commercial market because the commercial market's often even more fractured.
That's a great point. And let me jump back in with the alternative to all of what I just said and how it can work. As a counterexample, you know, Shield AI, you know, defense startup also based in San Diego. Obviously, you know them pretty well. They've risen up pretty well, and they did SBIRs early on, and they were very successful with that. So don't take my word that it can't be done. It can be, but it requires careful thought about that, careful walling off of exactly what you're signing over and what you're not, why you're doing it, whether it's a distraction, as you said. So it can be done. I think, you know, just needs to be careful.
So this may be my personal bias, but I do think that all SBIRs are not created equal, right? The government is going to play favorites based on where their strategic priorities are. Counter drone, awesome, like high. Like when we come across SBIRs that are more aligned with what we do, base protection, force protection, and garrison, it's gonna be much lower priority, right? Shield AI, like autonomous pilots, dude, that's huge. Like there's a pilot shortage worldwide. Most developing countries, including the United States, have a pilot shortage right now. So they're solving a problem that can change the game for U.S. primacy for the next 50 years, right? So SBIRs in that domain are going to be really, really high priority, and you have a probably much better chance of advancing, I think. So,
yeah, I mean, I'm hearing the trend of the focus, right? We talked about this sort of early on understanding ICP and go-to-market, but you use that sort of the feature sort of request example, right? Like my head of solutions engineering is laughing because we literally have a tracker that's like request and like what TAM do we think this unlocks and why and where does it sit? And it is literally, if you can't convict it of bringing us an additional 2 this quarter, like I'm not really interested in it unless there's some strategic reason. I would argue it's the same thing as you're thinking about SBIRs, right? Having that sort of long and being able to rationalize across, and also like the day you get your first SBIR phase 1 or OTA or whatever, you should be thinking about your phase 3, the structure, or your production contract, depending on whatever vehicle. You should be thinking about, you know, those kind of barriers we talked about earlier, right? Hey, your software, great. How are you getting an ATO? Start on that on day 0. Hey, do you need a facility clearance? Start on that day 0. Where you see a lot of organizations fail is they'll go through a phase 2, and they'll be like, yeah, this is sick. And they'll get to the end, and they'll be like, oh, yeah, no, I'll go get approval to deploy my software inside the government in my phase 3. Like, who the hell is going to buy a fucking enterprise contract that I can't deploy the software? But that happens all the time. So you've just got to be aware of that. And it's the same way as if you were going into a bank or a pharmaceutical industry, right? Like, it's regulated. You got to think about, your deployment patterns and your compliance requirements. So, all right, we got go.
Oh, sorry. I love the comparison to commercial feature requests because we get them all the time as well, and we weigh them on 3 domains, right? Like, how badly does a customer want this? Like, build things that people want. Like, how big is their pain, first of all? Second of all is, what's the technical feasibility? Can we build something? Can we build an MVP in a week? Or is this some deep R&D that we have to do that's going to take us 6 months? And the third one is obviously a size of the market. Like, if we build it for this customer, can we turn this around and make it for all the other similar customers in the world? If it fulfills those 3, then we should go out there and freaking build it, right? The thing with the government and CBERS is the only difference is that because there's a $3 billion annual budget for CBERS, the government will just throw money around for their random feature requests like it's candy. And yeah, I think a lot of startups fall into that trap where like, hey, there was a CBER out there for this. It must mean the government wanted it. No, the government is just like that customer. It's like, this is really cool. It'll be really cool to have. Can you build this for us? And they'll fix some money to it, but there's no follow-through behind it.
No, I was laughing watching my CTO laugh as you were talking about technical complexity because I don't ask him anymore. I'm like, sick, I sold this feature. It'll be great. Like, we'll announce it in 2 months. It's like he's a little jealous if he's working with me and not you. So we got the 5-minute warning a couple minutes ago, so I want to kind of bring us in on a soft landing here. This has been an awesome conversation, right? And I think we've talked about some of the challenges, I think some of the excitement. Like, there's clearly a bunch of money. There's a lot of impact you can make. What I want to do is sort of parting shot, thing you guys are most excited about this year. Like, let's end this on a high note. Sorry, Matt.
Cool, thanks. First off, thank you for moderating. Thank you for Context Ventures for inviting us. The parting shot of thing we're most excited about, I'll come to second. First, I wanted to say, I think, again, this is a large group of people thinking of starting a company or some other entrepreneurship. Life is full of chapters. I'm not that old, I'm 37, but they're full of them, right? And what you did for the 5 or 20 years in the military doesn't need to define the rest of your life. Enjoy it, like I love coming to these things, but if you are an operations officer or something in a company command, does not mean you need to do operations for the rest of your life. The amount of vets that I've met, they're like, I'm gonna do operations because I was the OPSO of a battalion or something. Just like, don't do that. Spend the time to think about what you want to do with the rest of your time on the planet and whatever the next chapter and the one after that looks like. What's really cool about it though, and I won't mention names, but there's folks in the audience who I knew in earlier chapters of my life, and it's fun to see, like, as you progress through life, how those come back a second or third or fourth time. A couple of them gave checks, a couple of them have been advisors, in fact, some of them have been employees. So it's really fun and enjoy the journey. As far as the thing I'm most excited about, barring any major setback, we should be having a commercial launch this year. So that's pretty cool.
Wow. I mean, I think one thing that excites me in a lot of these kinds of discussions, talking about defense dual use and the startup world, is how much recognition there's been over the last few years of the opportunities in this space and the importance and the mission and the impact that can be had. And I'm excited about the fact that when the world of NFTs and image giraffes is falling apart, I think there's often a re-recognition of the importance of real solid technologies that have real important missions and uses in the real world, and that aren't a fad. So that always excites me. Also, I think just as a slight aside, I think there are also a lot of opportunities in the world right now with the conflict going on in Ukraine, where there are opportunities to directly impact real events and real people, and there are a lot of opportunities to field systems out there and do good work. So that's another area that I'm excited about.
Also want to shout out to Context Ventures and Tim. First time I was introduced to him, it was just like Taiwanese people connecting. Then 30 minutes in, he goes, all right, I want to be your first Series A investor. So I guess that's only in a freaking veteran community does that happen, right? My best friend gave me $10,000 when I was personally running out personal runway. Venmoed me, said, don't expect this money back. A guy I met in line at SIF, turning my shit in Camp Pendleton, wrote me a $25,000 check, C check, with no due diligence. Only in veteran community does that happen. Just that brotherhood and sisterhood is just incomparable anywhere else in the world. So for advice that I would give to people here who are trying to start a company or think about starting a company, my advice is do it. As long as you don't, you're not mortgaging your primary home or your freaking firstborn's university tuition, maybe don't do that. But outside of that, start a company. And the reason is because the United States of America is the only freaking country in the world where being a failed entrepreneur is something that people respect. The only country in the world, right? Like if you go and apply for a job and you go and tell your interviewer your experiences of building a company and tell them it didn't work out, this is bonus points for you. And during a recession, there's a lot of freaking talented people out there that are looking to do something new. And I can tell you that finding a co-founder is one of the hardest parts of your startup journey. And being a solo founder, I strongly don't recommend. My co-founder, who's no longer, he resigned a few months ago, because he had some health issues. But without him, this company would have died 10 times, right? He had such strong complementary skill sets to me that, I learned so much for him that I benefit, just my 4 years working with him, I benefited for the rest of my life. And if you're starting a company, and I was lucky enough because I found him when he was still in business school and he didn't have opportunity costs. There's a lot of talented people out there who may not have opportunity costs right now. Go start that company. Don't worry about failing because this country, this society still respects you if you do. As for what I'm excited about, well, last year was a bit of a slog. I'll be honest with you. Tim's got my investor emails, and some of them didn't sound too hot, but we just 10x'd our sales team. Not 10x as in 10 more bodies, as in capability 10x. This pipeline I'm seeing in January, I've never seen this pipeline over the past 2 years. Our sales team is just 10 times more competent than it was before. I got a new CRO that's built 2 unicorns. I've never been more excited. Everybody from top to bottom in our company has never been more excited. So we'll see what the year brings. Don't want to overpromise and underdeliver, but it's looking like it could be a big year for us.
Hey, I want to thank everybody. Context, this is awesome. Thank you guys for hosting. I'll say I'm excited that we've probably got 4 or 5 generations in here of vets that are all working to help each other figure this out. We're all learning. We're all a strong community. I've got a bunch of folks in here who mentored me on my first go, and I try to pay it forward. So that's what I'm excited about, is everyone here trying to help everyone else sort of succeed, because there's plenty of pie to go around. So thanks, guys.